Can you guys hear me now? Okay, all right. Okay, it's past 9 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started, I guess. That is not the PowerPoint I wanted. I want to just finish up what we were talking about last time, which is food webs in the context of this food web in the northeastern United States that was in this paper that I exposed you to last time. So can you guys see my PowerPoint? All right, good. So we were technical difficulties. All right, let's try this again. All right, so we were going through this food web. These people were studying these experimental plots in the northeastern United States, and this was after a masting event. So remember, well, why is it not sharing like it normally does? Okay. All right. So can you guys see this? The slides? Okay. You have the slides also, but so after a masting event is when oak trees basically put out a huge amount of acorns. We get them occasionally here in the Midwest. This year appears not to be a masting event. Acorn abundance seems kind of normal here. But these masting events basically provide a lot of acorns that a lot of organisms use for food. And so after this masting event, there was this increase in the abundance of mice. And then during this time period when gypsy moths are going through pupation, they removed mice from the experimental plots, and that lowered their population numbers. And you can see that the control plots, the population numbers are still high. Winter comes on, and during winter, populations decline over winter typically. But during this winter, they added acorns to the environment, once again in the experimental plots, which is why these dark circles are higher the following spring than the open circles are. These are the experimental plots where they added acorns. These are the control plots where they didn't. And then over the course of that year, these numbers slowly come back together in terms of the number of mice. And so there's a lot going on in figure 1 here. There's the growth of mice, there's the removal of mice. The removal of mice on the experimental plots occurs at the same time as the gypsy moths are pupating. Why are gypsy moths pupating? Why is that important? Becomes important later on. Then we have this winter decline, but the winter decline is not as heavy in the places where acorns were supplemented over winter. And then the next couple of figures actually are timed at different times in this timeline. So in this paper, understanding the timeline of what's happening and where it's happening is important. So in the second figure, we have the larvae per tree, we have the number of pupae, and then we have the number of egg masses. But what you have to do is you have to read the figure caption carefully to realize that these are all done at different times. The larvae per tree are done before the mouse removals, and the larvae are actually up in the tree canopy. They're not down on the ground where mice are. they climb down the tree in order to pupate. And when they get down onto the ground and pupate, they're then susceptible to predation by mice and other organisms. And in the mouse removal plots, there were many more pupae than there were in the non-mouse removal plots. And those plots also produced more eggs the following year. And so if you have the same number of larvae, but you have more pupae and more eggs, presumably these pupae are growing up and going through pupation and then emerging out of their pupal cases to produce adults that then go on to lay eggs the following spring. So this is showing the influence of mouse predation on gypsy moth populations, gypsy moth dynamics. Mice don't affect the number of larvae in the tree, but they do affect the pupae and they do affect egg laying by adults the following spring. So then we have this last plot that has to do with ticks, and you can see that there are way more ticks per meter squared on the acorn supplemented plots, the experimental plots where they added acorns, many fewer ticks in plots where they didn't add acorns, and this is the ticks per meter. But when you look at the number of ticks per mouse, you find that this difference in the number of ticks per meter isn't due to these mice being afflicted more on a per individual basis by ticks. They have about the same number of ticks, which is slightly significant. So they have about the same number of ticks on each mouse. So the difference in the number of ticks per meter square must just be due to the fact that there are more mice. Once again, indicating that you provide acorns with food over the winter, they convert that acorn abundance into the production of new mice, and then the ticks feed on those mice, and so you get an uptick, so to speak. Pun totally unintended. You get this increase in tick abundance once again later in the summer. So they did all this. This is not really the way I thought it was going to be. This animation has gone wrong. So oak trees basically contribute to acorns. So if you have a good year for oak trees are going to have a good year for acorns, then that's going to be a good year for mice. That means that that's going to be a good year for ticks, and that's going to be a terrible year for gypsy moths. So the pluses here on this side, this plus goes with this plus, goes with this plus, goes with this plus, but this plus goes with this minus. And so the ones to the left-hand side are this first set of arrows. If you have a lot of acorns, you'll get a lot of deer. If you have a lot of deer, you'll get a lot of ticks. And if you have a lot of ticks, you're going to get a lot of Lyme disease. On the right-hand side, if it's a bad year for oak trees, it's a bad year for acorns, which means that it's a bad year for mice and deer, which means that tick abundance goes down, which means that Lyme disease goes down. But those mice, not being very abundant, they don't prey upon the gypsy moths. That's positive for gypsy moths, which then has a negative effect on oak trees. So this is a relatively simple food web. And the reason, like I said in class on Monday, the reason that these people were studying this food web wasn't because they were all that interested in the dynamics between acorn masting events, oak masting events, and tick abundance and mice abundance. They were really interested in how these ecological processes are influencing an issue that is a human health issue, which is year-to-year variation in the incidence of Lyme disease. And it turns out that if you understand what's going on with the ecology of these organisms, you can do some things about predicting when Lyme disease will flare up, and you can then warn people about their behavior out in nature. So this is a simple food web. This is a more complicated food web. Food webs can be relatively simple or relatively complex. It depends on what your focus of study is, and it also depends on what the complexity of your ecosystem is. And the reason that I'm bringing this up now is that I want us to talk about the food webs that we have encountered in the omnivore's dilemma up to this point. And you probably weren't thinking about these farms that we have been encountering. And there are two farms. There's George Naylor's farm in Iowa, and there's Joel Salatin's polyface farm. We encountered Naylor's farm in the first part of the book that dealt with the food system based on corn, and we're encountering Joel Salatin's polyface farm when we are looking at the second section of the book that is talking about these more integrated ways of doing farming. And so what crops does George Naylor raise? This is the time when you unmute yourself and you respond.
Wasn't it just corn and soybeans?
Yeah, this is a corn and soybean operation. He has about 420 acres that he owns, and about 10 years ago, he converted 90 of that to organic production, but the remainder is still using standard conventional methods of raising these grain and bean crops. Joel Salatin's farm is focused on what? Producing what type of crops? Somebody other than Mary.
He's the one that has like the cows, pigs, chickens, bunnies.
Yeah, so he's a meat farmer, but in this section on Polyface Farm, what does he claim he is? What is he farming according to him? Somebody other than Mackenzie or Mary.
Can you repeat the question?
What does Joel Salatin claim he farms? He would not call himself a meat farmer. He calls himself what kind of farmer? Winston, is that you groaning into the microphone?
Yeah, I don't really know. I can't remember.
What's the title of the first chapter in this section of the Omnivore's Dilemma? I think it's the first chapter of the second section of the book. It is the first chapter.
You said the second section?
Yeah, the second section, part 2 of the book. It's on the screen in front of you.
Is it the forward?
What's that?
Grass.
It's grass. He would refer to himself as a grass farmer. And so his view is that if he keeps his grass healthy, then that enables him to raise all of these other meat animals that he is growing and selling to people and selling to restaurants, etc. And so he would not term himself a meat farmer. He would term himself a grass farmer. Well, we can think of these two farms from the standpoint of both food webs and from the standpoint of nutrient cycling. And so let's take George Naylor's farm first, and then we'll modify our figure to Joel Salatin's farm. Oh, that's not erasing very well. So I've already put soil up here on the board in anticipation of this. So on Naylor's farm, what does he have growing on his soil?
Corn and soybeans.
Yeah, basically corn and soybeans. So we're going to put corn and soybeans here. As I like to do, I put 2 boxes for the plants. There's an above ground box where the leaves and the shoot portion of the plant will be, and then there's a below ground box where the roots are. From the standpoint of food webs, we're mainly thinking about energy flowing through ecosystems, but we could just as easily also think about nutrients flowing through ecosystems. But for now, let's think about it as a food web and think only of energy. So we're not going to concern ourselves with the fact that soybeans fix nitrogen and add nitrogen to the soil in the process of being grown, because we're just going to deal with energy. So all energy from the production of plants is ultimately harvested from the sun. So we have solar energy coming in here, and photosynthesis is basically this pathway of energy from the sun being harnessed and captured by plants and stored as glucose. Now, this corn and soybean, what happens to it? On Naylor's farm? Marcus, help us out. Marcus, are you there?
Yeah, I've just got on Zoom, so I'm like kind of confused.
Okay, we're talking about a food web at the at George Naylor's farm in Iowa, which is primarily a corn and soybean producing farm.
Mm-hmm.
So once George Naylor grows his corn and soybeans, what does he do with those corn and soybeans? Does he feed them to his farm animals?
Yes.
No, he doesn't have any farm animals. What does he do with them? Kenton, help Marcus out. What was that?
Do you ask me the question?
I did ask you a question.
Oh, yeah, he just sells them.
Yeah, he just sells them. He harvests them, and he sends them off farm to a processing plant where they get processed into various food. And this food may feed humans somewhere, but it's not on the farm. And it may feed animals somewhere, but once again, it's not on the farm. And so this is a long distance export out of the Naylor farm ecosystem to another place. What other plants might there be at Naylor's farm? These are his two main crops. What other plants are going to be in his fields? You guys need to wake up today. I realize it's cold today. I'm in my office in a stocking cap because my office is cold. Alyssa, what other plants might be in his fields? Alyssa, are you there? This is what's difficult when I can't see you. I don't know who's actually there and who's not. Blake. Blake. Winston, I know you're there because you spoke earlier.
Yes. So you said what kind of other plants you would have?
Yeah, what other plants would you have in these corn and soybean fields?
I'm not exactly sure. Could it just be like other fruits or something, or other crops?
No, because these are the only two crops that he grows. He's a very traditional Midwestern farmer from the standpoint of his crop mixture, which is basically corn and soybeans. If you're a corn and soybean farmer, what do you want to get rid of in your fields?
Weeds.
Who's that?
Olivia.
Is that Mackenzie? Oh, that's Olivia. Olivia. I didn't call on you yet because you normally talk. Yeah, you want to get rid of weeds, right? Why do you want to get rid of weeds?
Because they can take nutrients from the crops and like interfere with the crops.
Exactly. They absorb nutrients from the soil that are then, that's a form of competition with the crops that you're trying to grow. And they also absorb water from the soil. So whatever irrigation you're doing, you're irrigating not only your crops, but also whatever weeds are there. How do we normally get rid of weeds? Somebody else, Kenton.
You can use like herbicides or I don't know. I think, yeah,
Okay, you
herbicides.
can use herbicides, but one of the things that George Naylor is very proud of is that in his entire time of running his farm, which he started running in 1976 after he graduated from the University of California at Berkeley and went back home to the family farm, he does not use genetically modified organisms, and by that we mean genetically engineered organisms. So he doesn't have Roundup Ready crops on his farm, so he can't use herbicides. So if he can't use herbicide, how do you get rid of weeds? Kinsey. And Kenton, by the way, there's no way that you would have known that. There's no way that you would have known that. I knew that from other reading. So using herbicide is a perfectly appropriate way to answer that question. It just happens to not be true in this case. Mackenzie, what's another way we can get rid of weeds?
If you're not able to use herbicides, and I'm gonna guess that like spraying is out of the question too.
What was that?
Spraying, like sprays.
No, because those sprays would be herbicides. So
Yeah.
if you
So
can't,
I guess it'd be like hand picking.
So hand picking is going to be pretty hard on 420 acres.
Yeah.
So there's a much more labor efficient way of doing it. Yeah.
You just plow them?
Yeah, you would just till between the rows. And so when you see these tilling, these plowing instruments, they're basically spaced, the space between the rows, and you would just go between the rows and you would dig up the plants that are between the rows, leaving the rows of corn and soybeans intact. And so you would get rid of as many weeds as you can by tilling, so that you only leave corn and soybeans in the field. If you don't have a lot of weeds, what other kinds of animals are you going to have on the farm? So George Naylor isn't growing cattle and sheep and pigs and things like that like Salatin is, but there are organisms out there in nature that are going to be in these fields. What kind of organisms might you expect to see?
Deer.
Deer. Okay, so you might expect to see wild deer. Deer love cornfields. What other organisms might you expect to see?
Raccoons.
Okay, things like raccoons.
Possums.
Oh my gosh, possums.
Insects and snakes.
Okay, who was that?
Kenton.
Oh, Kenton. Talk to me a minute about insects. You just said insects.
Mm-hmm.
Would you expect to find insects on a farm that's growing corn and soybeans? Why or why not?
My guess would be yes, just because like insects occupy like basically everywhere, but I don't have any specific answers.
But what do insects eat?
Shit.
Okay, so now you're thinking about polyface farm, but what else do insects eat? So you're thinking about the fly larvae and the cowpats, but there's a much broader array of insects out there in nature.
Don't some insects eat like leaves or like plants?
Yeah, they feed on the vegetative parts and the fruits of plants. And so there's a corn borer that is a problem in people's corn crops. There is a corn earworm beetle that people have problems with. They get into the ears and they eat the ear of corn itself, the kernels of the ear of corn itself. So there are a bunch of insect pests. How do farmers get rid of insect pests?
Pesticides.
Okay, so you can just spray pesticides. So you can't spray pesticides on the 90 acres of his farm that he's growing organically, but you can spray pesticides on the other remaining, what's 420 minus 90? You can spray pesticides on the remaining 330. And if you're spraying to get rid of insect pests, then you're not going to have a ton of insects there. And because you don't have a ton of insects there, you're also going to probably have fewer raccoons and fewer opossums. And Kenton, what was the other organism that you talked about?
Snakes.
You're going to have fewer snakes because there are also all kinds of ground-dwelling rodents that snakes would be feeding on that once again are going to be there not only for the crops themselves, but also for the things that feed on those crops, things like insects. So deer mice and things like that you would normally find on farms, but deer mice are insectivores. They also eat grain crops, but they eat a lot of insects. And as a result, you're not going to have as many of those. And so by getting rid of the insects, you kind of break a chain of energy flow. Normally energy flow would flow out of soybeans and corn into insects, and then those things would be eaten by other things, even though deer would eat the corn and soybeans, soybeans both, and deer do not eat insects, but these other kind of consumers do. And so by getting rid of those in favor of preserving your crop species, you really do reduce the overall abundance of other animals on his farm. And that's actually good from the standpoint of George Naylor, because he wants to reserve as much of that crop as possible to be harvested and shipped off to off-farm consumption. And so one of the ways of thinking about this particular food web is it's a really simple food web. Energy comes into the food web, it gets fixed by corn and soybeans. We've removed other plant species, we've removed all of the insect species, and so really the main consumer probably on his farm are things like deer that come through and eat the crops, but my guess is he probably does whatever he can to reduce that as well. And so you have this kind of one-way flow of energy into the plants and then out to consumers. And so it's a really simple, reduced kind of food web. Not very many species and a flow of energy where energy comes in and after a season, it all leaves again because these things get harvested and shipped off. Now let's look at the situation at Polyface Farm. We will leave the sun there. I think it's time to clean my whiteboard. So we have soil down here. I'm going to give myself more room because there's more to keep track of. What kinds of plant crops is Joel Salatin growing?
Grasses.
He's growing grass. I'm going to put grass in parentheses here because what he's really growing is pasture. And in pasture, there's plenty of grass, but what else is there in pasture? If you were to go out to an old field, if you leave the campus, cross the street down at Mill Street and go just, a half a mile outside of town, you'll pass an old field, a pasture that's been allowed to go fallow. It's actually for sale right now. And if you walked into that pasture, would you just see grass or would you see other things?
Would you see weeds in there?
Okay, so what do you mean by weed? So grass is actually in many cases considered to be a weed, depending on the kind of grass.
So I don't know if this is right, but I know like kind of where I live, there's like a field, but there's basically like your traditional weeds that you see like growing kind of off to the side of the grass, like by like where everything stops. And I know it. So
what kind of plants would you expect to find there? I mentioned one of them actually. I don't know when it was. Oh, when we were talking about rotational grazing, when the chickens go into the the newly vacated pasture area where the cows have been feeding, the first thing that they do when they walk into there, what do they go for?
There's lots of poop.
They don't go for the poop first. They go for something else first. A type of
Clover.
plant. What's that?
Isn't it clover?
Yeah, clover. Why do they go for clover? Have you ever eaten clover from a field?
Isn't it sweet?
It is sweet. Why else do they? So there's energy in there, so that it has a sweet flavor to it. So there's sugar in it. But what else is in clover? Because it's a special type of plant. It's in a family called the Fabaceae. Now you guys are thinking, damn, he gave us Fabaceae, and I was supposed to remember that. What does that mean? Give you Fabaceae before the last test. We talked about the Fabaceae when we were talking about nitrogen cycling. Terrible when test 2 is passed and he's still asking you questions about material that was on test 2. Fabaceae are the family of legumes. What are legumes?
Like beans and peanuts.
Yeah, beans and peanuts and things like that. And what do they do? What's special about them?
They have protein.
They have protein because what do they do in terms of nitrogen cycle?
They can fix nitrogen.
They fix nitrogen. They take N2 out of the atmosphere and they convert it into ammonia. And then that is a easily transportable form of nitrogen between organisms. So if we were making a food web, and we are making a food web, we would oftentimes put plants into different functional groups. And so in this case, grasses would be very different from legumes, for example, because they do differ in terms of their growth potential and their utility to other organisms, because legumes are capable of fixing nitrogen and grasses generally are not capable of fixing nitrogen. So we could take this pasture and we could bust it down into grasses and legumes, but then we could also make another category. And this is a type of plant that I haven't given you yet in class, so I'll just give it to you. So we have legumes, above ground and below ground. And then we have what we call forbs. And forbs are just the non-grassy herbaceous vegetation. So herbaceous vegetation is vegetation that's not woody. So there are plenty of plants that do secondary growth. We talked about secondary growth way back at the beginning of the semester when we talked about the structure of the plant body. So whenever you have trees and things like this that grow in diameter over time, they're laying down wood. And so wood is hard to digest, and so most animals don't eat wood. But forbs are non-woody plants. And legumes are forbs also, but these are nitrogen-fixing forbs as opposed to non-leguminous forbs. So they're forbs that don't produce nitrogen. We have forbs that do fix nitrogen, and then we have grasses. And so these would be three kind of big categories of plants that are found in Joel Salatin's farm. So when we look at this, all three of these are fixing energy. They're fixing carbon. And then once that carbon is fixed, who is eating these plants?
chickens.
Okay, so chickens are going to be eating these plants. Well, let's put chickens over here. Who else is going to be eating these plants?
The cattle.
Cows are going to be eating these plants. Who else is going to be eating these plants?
Insects.
Insects, all kinds of insects. We'll put them in this big category, but realize that when we say insects, we're probably talking about hundreds or thousands of different species of insects. And why do they have so many insects at Polyface Farm?
For the diet of the chickens, like from the plants and then from cow patties and everything else.
Well, there's a more fundamental reason, and it's one of the fundamental ways in which Naylor Farm differs from Polyface Farm, not just in terms of the crops that they're growing, but because Naylor's farm is focused on plant production of a couple of different species, what does he want to get rid of as much as possible?
The insects.
He wants to get rid of insects. And so one of the things that George Naylor is doing that Joel Salatin is not doing is he's using pesticides. Salatin doesn't want to use pesticides because, of course, what are the insects serving? As the insects serve a purpose on Salatin's farm. What is Polyface Farm getting from the insects?
It's a diet for the chickens.
Yeah, so one of the things that these insects are going to be doing is these insects are going to be feeding the chickens. So these insects are eating all of these different plants. That energy from the insects is now going to feed the chickens. We've talked about this from a nutrient cycling standpoint, but what are the cows and chickens both doing in terms of putting things back into the soil?
Fertilizing.
Yeah, so the cows are pooping, the chickens are pooping, the cows in specific are putting down these cow pats. In this case, flies, which is a type of insect, basically lay larvae. And so we have fly larvae that are growing in the cow patties. So whatever energy is in the cow patties is going into the fly larvae. And then we've talked about how the chickens go in there and dig around in those cow patties. They seek out the fly larvae and eat them. What this does for the chickens, because the chickens are eating a lot of insects from just insects they're feeding on the plants, and they're also eating these fly larvae, the insects are getting the chickens are getting a lot more protein in their diet, and they're getting a lot more fat in their diet. And this influences the quality of the chickens if you're going to use them for meat production, and it also influences the quality of the eggs. How does this food web look? Well, let's finish the food web first. Let's just stick with cows and chickens for now. What ultimately happens to these cows and chickens? Same thing that happens to corn and soybeans at George Naylor's farm.
They get sold out to a butcher or processor.
Yeah. They basically get sold and are consumed by humans off farm. That's the goal of all of that. So energy does still have this one-way flow through this ecosystem. It comes from the sun, it bops around for a while, and it flows out. But what happens to that energy at Salatin's farm, at Polyface Farm, that's different from George Naylor's farm? How is energy flow different in this farm as opposed to the other farm?
Doesn't go directly through.
Yeah, it spends a lot more time moving around within the ecosystem. It's not just a straight shot into the plants and then out to the consumer. The energy is being moved around a lot more. If you did a diagram like this for nutrient cycling, you would see that the nutrients are being moved around a lot more. It's interesting to do this with nutrients because on Naylor's farm, where do the nutrients for George Naylor's plants come from?
The sun.
Okay, nutrients aren't coming from the sun, that's energy coming from the sun. Nutrients are things like nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur, potassium, calcium, all those things.
The soil.
Okay, so they're coming from the soil, but every year when George Naylor harvests the corn and the soybeans from his farm, not only is taking all the energy from that farm and shipping it off the farm, he's also taking all the nutrients that are pent up in those crops and shipping it off the farm. As a result, that export of nutrients off the farm has to be replaced. How does he go about replacing those things?
Fertilizing the field.
Yeah, he's going to be bringing in fertilizer from something like a fertilizer plant, and he's going to spray that fertilizer onto his fields. That will put the nutrients back into the soil. Once the nutrients are back into the soil, they can be absorbed by the plants the next time he plants a crop of corn and soybeans. Where are nutrients coming from in this system? The Polyface farm, Joel Salatin's farm.
The soil as well as the animals.
So they're coming from the soil, and so that's ultimately the ultimate source of these nutrients. But when those plants and animals, well, when the animals themselves get harvested, you're losing some of the nutrition of the soil because it's being exported off the farm to market. But before it gets shipped off, what has happened to a lot of the nutrients that were in those organisms? They went back to the soil through things like excretion. And so if you were to do a similar analysis of looking at the food web at Joel Salatin's farm from the standpoint of how nutrients flow around on the farm, you would see that there's a lot of recycling of nutrients in the same way that there's a lot of moving around of energy on that farm. And this is what Michael Pollan refers to as the genius of the place. So in that first chapter of the second portion of the book, it's one of the two chapters that I've asked you to read so far. It's called the All Flesh is Grass chapter. I think it was in here. Oh yeah, on page 125 of your book, he has the second part of the chapter is called The Genius of the Place. And this is the genius of the place by practicing complexity, by having a highly diverse farm. You are utilizing the energy contained in the farm in an efficient sort of way, and you're utilizing the nutrient content that is contained in the farm in an efficient way. You're keeping more of those nutrients on the land rather than shipping them off by harvesting the plants. And so it ends up being a much more sustainable way of growing meat than the more traditional ways of growing meat, because he's taking advantage of not only the artificial parts of the food web, things like cows and chickens, but also taking advantage of the natural parts of the food web, things like the insect community that then feed the chickens and give chickens better meat quality, better egg quality, and things like this. So the other chapter that I've asked you to read so far is the chapter called Practicing Complexity. Chapter 11, this chapter, Practicing Complexity, is all about this. And it's important that you understand how this farm differs from the Naylor farm in terms of its complexity and what those differences mean in terms of kind of how sustainable the farm is from the standpoint of, on George Naylor's farm, you have a low diversity of crops. Those crops are supported by things like the uses of herbicides and pesticides, but they're also supported by the import of a lot of energy to the farm in the form of things like nitrogen containing fertilizers. Remember that fixing nitrogen is a very energy intensive process. And because it's so energy intensive, whenever you put fertilizer on your field, whether you're a farmer or whether you're, a backyard gardener like I am, whenever you put those fertilizers on, what you're also bringing in is a huge amount of energy investment that has been made in growing those crops. And so Naylor's farm lacks some efficiencies because there's a lot of imported energy and nutrients into his farm in order to get those corn and soybean crops out. At Joel Salatin's farm, the main thing driving this system is energy coming into the farm from the sun, because he's not fertilizing his fields with anything other than the fertilizer that is coming to him from the cows and the chickens. And so he doesn't have that large energy investment in artificial fertilizers. He also doesn't have any energy investment in pesticides and things like that. And so he uses the natural functioning of an ecosystem to reduce the number of inputs that he has to put into the farm in order to get meat out of the farm. And that's what the chapter Practicing Complexity is all about. So if you've read it already, great. You might want to reread it again now that we've been through nutrient cycling and talking about food webs and the complexity of food webs. If you haven't read it, you really should probably read it at this point, because we've now covered one of the main purposes of that chapter in his book, which is getting across the idea that this complex system is very different from George Naylor's simpler system. Questions about this? Now, I told you last time, for the last test, that I would not make you draw a nutrient cycling diagram on the test. I told you that I would give you a nutrient cycling diagram and then have you work with that. And as I was making out the test, I got to the last question on the test, and I realized after I wrote the question, I was basically asking you to create a nutrient cycle from scratch. I had given you a lot of information in the question such that it should have been an easy task, but I wrote it the day before, and overnight, I guess my brain thought about the exam while I was sleeping, and I woke up the next morning, and the first thing that came to me when I woke up is I did something on the test that I told them that I wasn't going to do on the test. So I came in early that morning and I rewrote the last question on the test to be more in line with what I told you I would do on the test. And so while I will still not ask you to do that on the exam on any future exam from the standpoint of nutrient cycling, doing a food web is actually a pretty easy task. We've just done it without having to think too terribly hard about it for Polyface Farm and for the Naylor Farm. And so one of the things that you might expect to see on the next test that we have is you might be asked to briefly sketch the complexity of the Polyface Farm from a food web standpoint and the complexity of George Naylor's farm from a food web standpoint. And then I might ask you a series of questions about the implications of those two differences in complexity. Is that clear? Okay, good. Olivia gave me the thumbs up, the visual thumbs up. So there are a couple of things that I want you to read between now and Friday. in The Omnivore's Dilemma, chapter 2, which we've not really talked much about, but I think we should go back and talk about now. Read chapter 2, and I want you to pay especially close attention to section 3 of chapter 2, which is entitled Vanishing Species. It talks about the diversity of farms historically versus the diversity of farms in the year, 2006 when this was written, or when was this written? Yeah, 2006 when this was written, but things haven't really changed that much since 2006. But if you think about farms back in the 1800s, the mid 1800s, farms were very different places. And those farms really didn't change all that much from the 1850s to the 1930s from that perspective, from the standpoint of the diversity of species that were on farms. And then the other thing that I want you to read is chapter 13. Chapter 13 is called The Market, Greetings from the Non-Barcode People. And I want you to, in chapter 13, I want you to read the whole chapter, but I want you in particular to pay attention to eggs in this chapter and what Poland says about Joel Salatin's eggs and what Joel Salatin himself says about his eggs. So 2 readings, chapter 2 and chapter 13 for Friday. That's where we'll start on Friday. But then what we're going to start talking about on Friday is we're going to start. Oh, wait. Friday is what? I forgot. It left my brain. What are we doing on Friday?
Presentations.
We're doing presentations. So these readings you should prepare for Monday, not Friday. And then on Monday, so Friday, we're going to get the genetic engineering presentations from each of the 3 groups. And then what we'll do on Monday is we'll get back into covering the material that we want to cover. We'll start by talking about chapter 2 and chapter 13 in the Omnivore's Dilemma. And then we're going to start talking about history and economics. So those of you who have been looking forward to the day that we stop talking about science, it comes on Monday. Questions?
I had thought you'd said the presentation was the 30th.
Yeah, that's what I heard too.
Oh, is it the 30th? Oh,
No.
yeah, we did decide that because we talked about Friday.
Yeah, a little bit of panic.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I did not mean to panic you. I'm just I'm having trouble keeping my own head straight what's going on. Okay, so on Friday, chapter 2 and chapter 13, and then Omnivore's Dilemma, and then we'll start talking about history and economics. And the other thing that you should probably do between now and Friday is go back and dredge up your knowledge of World War history from about the year 1900 to the present. So from the year 1900 to the present, lots of things have happened. We had 2 world wars, World War I, World War II. We had the consequences of those 2 world wars were huge. I was looking at economic data yesterday, actually, looking at differences in economic productivity of the United States under Democratic versus Republican administrations. And as it turns out, well, I won't spoil it for you, but one of the things that happened in Truman's administration is Truman's administration had one of the highest growths in gross domestic product anytime since World War II. But a big chunk of that was the fact that we were just coming off of World War II. And so the economic growth during Truman's administration was largely driven by us having successfully won World War II and the prosperity that immediately followed in the wake of that. So comparing, Democratic and Republican administrations in terms of economic growth is kind of skewed if you leave Truman in the mix, because his administration had this huge economic growth. But probably any president that was in office at that time would have also experienced that high level of growth because of all of the consequences of coming out of World War II. So think about the major things that happened. World War I, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, World War II, what things happened after World War II that were kind of the result of World War II. All of these things are going to become important in the next couple of weeks of our conversation in this class. We're going to cover history. It's going to be history that you've seen before in high school and maybe in college, but it's going to appear different to you because we're going to be looking at history through the lens of food and food production and agriculture. And as a result of that, we're going to talk about these events in ways that you haven't talked about them in a history class, perhaps. Questions? All right, then I will see you on Friday. Read.